So let's go back to our sheet that showed the salmon extinction and stock reduction numbers. And again, just to quickly summarize, the big shrinkage in total returning salmon happened here in the Pacific Northwest, including Northern California, unfortunately. And so why? So I gave you the 4-H's in the previous video, but I want to talk a bit more about these. So let's first talk a little bit about the genetic erosion of wild salmon. So some reasons why hatchery salmon in many settings are associated with extinctions and reductions of wild stocks. Okay. One of the problems was if you go back into the 1800s, it turns out that people didn't realize that there was a genetic basis for the ability of salmon to return to their home streams. It wasn't understood that the salmon the same exact ones would come back. If for example, there was a coho salmon, a particular species of salmon, coho salmon were the same everywhere. That was believed. Or Chinook salmon, whichever one it was. They noted the differences, real obvious, the differences between the 5 species, but they didn't understand that there was a huge amount of genetic diversity even within those, and that in fact, the salmon stocks in a particular part of a particular river, a particular tributary, were genetically different from even the salmon returning into that same river, but in other parts. And one of the problems, this meant that the variation in life history traits, it meant that many types of suitable habitats were used to spawn, and that's how the abundance of the species itself was maintained, of course, is that you have this huge geographic landscape that the same species was spawning in. So each species has huge genetic diversity. The problem is, once certain rivers and streams were impacted by human development, that particular race with a particular life history would be lost. Okay, so this is kind of going back. To the early observers, and essentially what we're saying is that any population of Chinook salmon from Alaska to California and from the lowermost to the uppermost parts of the Columbia River Basin, say for example, was the equivalent of any other population. Okay, simplistic, but that's how it was believed. And a lot of it was just we didn't know, and they believed that the salmon would go out on the ocean, and like for the ones that went out the Columbia River, would stay fairly near the Columbia River. When in fact now we know that that's not the case at all. We've been able to tag them, and so our science is so much better now. Okay, the problem is that because they believed that all of each species were the same, there was a huge amount of, in the early hatchery years when they were growing these in hatcheries to replenish the dwindling wild stocks in local areas, they would bring in hatchery stock from very distant areas, sometimes from different states even, and would then breed them in the local hatcheries. And then when those salmon were returned up into those streams, they didn't have the genetics to survive very well. So you get this kind of a problem. Just to give you an idea, the central hatchery, one that I've read about, it was constructed in the early 1900s on the Columbia River. It had the capacity to raise maybe like 60 million salmon eggs, something like that. Most of the production was of Columbia River Chinook salmon, but to maintain capacity, the hatchery also reared other salmon species such as sockeye salmon from Alaska. Chinook salmon from all parts of the Columbia Basin were spawned, from near the mouth to the Columbia to some of the headwaters of the Salmon River, all the way up into Idaho, amazingly. Okay, so hatchery management mixed together all indiscriminately and stocked them into the Columbia River and many other rivers. So that broke down the genetic diversity of the populations all through the area. That's great tragedy in the history. Once you've lost that, you've lost that. It took thousands of years for that to develop. So the good news is in the past 35 years or so, the reality of adaptive races and distinct populations has been widely accepted. And so now there's been a lot of efforts to, capture just the particular returning salmon in an area that are wild and use their eggs for the hatcheries in the local area. Okay, so that's progress, but so much of the damage was already done. Um, Another problem is that imagine you have, let's just explain this next one's kind of hard because some people say, well, if you're putting hatchery salmon out in the oceans along with the wild ones, survival of the fittest. And if the wild ones are really so good, then they'll survive and the hatchery won't. Hatch ones won't. But what we're realizing now that's a very short-sighted argument. Imagine you have a giant pool and you have the capacity of, say, 80 fish to live in this pool. And so you mix half of one kind and half of another. Okay, so you'll have a certain survival rate of each. But let's say that you just flood the fish with even more of the competitive type. Okay, even if the wild type, for example, are very fit, if they have more competitors, there is less total food available, even if they're genetically superior. Okay, and so by having a lot of competition in the marine environment for resources, like for example the great herring of the North Pacific, you're not going to have as many return, even regardless of their fitness. The fitness helps, but it's not enough. Okay. Another problem was in the 1960s, there was a rise in Oregon hatchery-raised salmon populations, and that caused a kind of overfishing momentum. What it was believed is, well, we've got so many fish, it doesn't really matter. We'll just, just keep raising more and more hatchery fish, and that will take care of the problem. Okay. But if you look at the wild harvest during that time, this is a tragedy. It peaked at 3.9 million in 1976, but collapsed to 28,000 in 1997. Okay. Along with this, there's a severe habitat degradation happening, where basically here's a problem. Okay. It's one thing to sort of say, okay, we manage the fishery offshore. There's only so many fish that can be taken. Okay, fine. But the problem with salmon is that they need to have rivers, and the rivers need to be healthy habitat. And that habitat generally needs to be kind of, the wilder it is, the better the habitat it is for the most part. Okay, the more like it would have been, pre-Columbia. Okay, now what happened was, of course, when you start talking about how to manage the banks along the rivers, that's the riparian habitat. Okay, now you're talking about all kinds of diverse ownership and management of these lands, everything from public lands to private lands. And private landowners don't want to be told they can't cut trees down along the bank or do whatever they want. And that's understandable. Okay? After all, they pay for the land. It should be theirs. But that it was easier to go along with that because it's politically just a very, very difficult problem. And you just compensate for it by just, let's put more and more stock into the hatcheries. So you're basically raising salmon now without real habitat in the stream environment. Okay. So that gave more time yet for the whole habitat problem to become worse. What I want to do now is let's shift over to, I'm going to pause this just for a tiny bit, and then we're going to come look at riparian. So let's switch over then to look at that environment, the streamside environment, the environment that's influenced by the stream or the river. We call that riparian. I took a whole class of this when I was in graduate school on riparian environments. Very fascinating stuff. I had a great instructor, Douglas Green, an authority on the subject. Really was lucky to have him as an instructor in that class. So we talked a little bit about the definition already. I'm not going to get real technical on that. That can take some time in itself. But the life web of streams and rivers is composed of, as in any other kind of environment, primary producers. Those are the photosynthesizer, the leaves, which tend to be the major primary producers, and the algae in most streams, the minor ones, except for some of the more desert streams. The consumers include the insects, the amphibians, birds, and some mammals such as beavers, fish, and invertebrates. Okay, so you're photosynthesizing up here. there's consumers eating those things, and then some of those higher order predators will eat some of the other consumers as well, of course, in the whole food web system. And then you got the decomposers too, which break down the organic material back into and mineralize it into form that can be useful. Okay, so you have that. Now there's and again, this is a handout that's on the course site. I just wanted to explain it a little bit. Okay, so some of the critical functions of riparian zones. So a healthy riparian zone, except in desert streams, which is we have a few of those in our region, but overall has an input of litter and woody debris to the streams, and that dead organic matter contributes most of the annual energy budget to the headwater streams having dense forest canopies. So lots of litter and woody debris to streams is a good start. Shading. Shading controls temperature. Remember, the warmer temperatures cause the fish to need to have more food for a given metabolic rate. So cooler streams, almost always better in almost the entire region. Okay. Bank stabilization. Okay. So if you've got healthy vegetation on the banks, you have a limited amount of fine sediment input, and the fine sediment input can choke the redds or the nesting sites where the salmon will dig in and lay their eggs. So you don't want lots of fine sediment. So you need stable banks and healthy, persistent, and in some cases perennial vegetation, including trees in many habitats, makes for more stable banks. Okay, so a healthy uptake and exchange of nutrients with aquatic habitats involves the ability of streams to retain algae and litter inputs for food resources and to retain the sediments for habitat. And that's determined by channel complexity, okay? Especially the accumulations of woody debris, okay? Complexity helps retain organic matter during high flows. I may show some stuff on another unit on this, but basically now people are literally allowing tree falls into these streams and rivers and not trying to get them out of the stream. Let them stay there. In fact, in some cases, even felling trees and having more woody debris in the streams. It gives them that greater accumulation and helps retain the organic matter during high flows, helps stabilize the gravels and fine sediments in these extreme environments. And remember the beavers in the Blue Mountains, that story? Well, you can kind of imagine how that complexity is enhanced by beavers as well in there. So that kind of environment is what we're talking about, a complex environment where the river gets slowed down, where it has multiple braided streams instead of one channel, where there's lots of material in the stream. There's large rocks, boulders, logs, okay, where it has lots of curves, okay, this sort of thing, and where the topography, of course, favors that, and so on. So the energy inputs into and the energy outputs of the riparian zone. Photosynthesis obviously is our big input, but the other big input, and now we're talking about nutrients, comes from the salmon themselves. A big deal is made about that. If you follow the documentary that we're going to have you look at, it's about 54 minutes, and it looks at the enormous store of nutrients, especially nitrogen, that the salmon bring back with them in the sea. They rot, and nitrogen is a building blocks, again, of protein, as we mentioned before, basically amino acids and protein. And nitrogen is limiting in almost every stream ecosystem in the world. That's especially in a fairly wild state, very limited. And those nitrogen inputs from the carcasses of the salmon feed literally the entire ecosystem, and in some cases can double or triple the tree growth rates. Yes, double or triple the tree growth rates in riparian habitats. The other one, though, that is really amazing is the red alder, especially on west side streams. The red alder tree, and I've mentioned these before, they can fix nitrogen from the air through nitrogen-fixing bacteria that they host in the nodules in their roots. And the red alder trees, which we've already studied those before, they are the most amazing fertilizer. They can literally put as much nitrogen into an acre as the fertilizer needs of an Iowa cornfield. So a really remarkable input as well. So lots of healthy alder trees, lots of growth in the ecosystem, healthy salmon,